So I'll start with a short introduction to the concepts, then talk for about 20 or 25 minutes on the different strategies or pathways for getting to scale, and discuss some cross-program lessons in getting to scale from the paper we recently published. We're then very lucky to have two very experienced M4P practitioners who will share their project experiences and reflections on getting to scale. So Julian is going to talk for 15 minutes on experiences, successes and failures in getting to scale from Propcom in Nigeria. So Julian, for those of you who don't know him, is an experienced private sector, rural development and agricultural finance expert with over 25 years of technical and management experience. So among other things, he served as team leader on Propcom in Nigeria from 2008 to 14. Julian, please jump in if I've misrepresented you or undersold you in any way.
No, you totally
then we'll move on to...
Totally
okay, apologies. Then we'll move on to Peter Roggekamp. So he's going to talk for about 15 minutes on Kavak and Cambodia, among other things. So Peter also has very extensive market systems development experience. I'm sure a lot of you have met Peter in various conferences over the years. He's currently team leader on investing in infrastructure, and before that he was team leader on Kavak. And then we'll have around 20 minutes for questions. If you want to ask a question, please use the chat box, and we also have the questions that you sent through previously. Okay, so moving on. So this webinar looks at kind of successes and failures of programs in scaling propoor innovations. So an innovation might be a new or improved product or service, such as mobile money, or a new or improved business practice, such as a new village-level distribution model that allows agro input suppliers to better reach and serve customers at the bottom of the pyramid. So for our purposes, the innovation must be propoor. So we want it to deliver some kind of benefits to the poor, either as consumers or as producers. And we want that to be sustainable. So initial pilots suggest that the innovation will generate a sufficient return to be sustained by market actors. So we're assuming that the market systems analysis has been done, an intervention strategy is developed, an innovation or more for addressing one of the systemic constraints identified in the MSA has been kind of developed and piloted, and then we're picking up the story at the scale-up phase. So how can programs take the initial pilot and support that innovation to reach scale? So we'll now look at 5 different strategies for getting to scale. So note that these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So for a given innovation, a program might try a number of different strategies. So that could be concurrently or sequentially, really depending on what is and is not working. So the most obvious strategy or pathway is to achieve scale through 1 or 2 big actors. So these are actors that have deep pockets. They may also have existing distribution networks, and they're really able to scale the innovation by themselves. So programs can then reach scale without any further competitive response. And in many of the celebrated cases of getting to scale that I'm sure many of you have read about, interventions actually passed the 1 million mark with just one company, and at least initially. So there's Notori with Propcom, which Julian will talk about later. Syngenta's work with Catalyst. So Syngenta's a global agribusiness with revenues of 13 billion in 2015, so pretty big. CBA's work with FSDK on the Mshwari product, so CBA is one of the largest banks in Kenya. So obviously this strategy is only feasible in countries or sectors where big actors exist, which may not be the case in countries like Liberia or Sierra Leone. If you only partner with one organization, there's also the risk of putting all your eggs in one basket. And there's also the risk of creating an anti-competitive outcome if the first mover advantage is too strong. So, there's some debate about whether that's now the case with M-Pesa, for example. So it may be possible to move up or down the supply chain in order to find these big actors. So, for example, if we're interested in introducing new business practices or innovations in input retailers, rather than work directly with the input retailers, who may number in the thousands, it may be possible to instead work with one or two large input suppliers who can then influence a large number of retailers in their sales network. So that becomes a leverage point that we can take advantage of. So the second strategy is to work with first movers to create a demonstration effect. So this is a very commonly cited scaling strategy. So the idea is that by working with a few first movers to demonstrate commercial viability, that influences the rest of the market. And the aim is for other players to then autonomously emulate the first movers and crowd in around that innovation. So we can think of players in a market or a sector as falling into 5 categories. So you've got the innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards. So these terms were introduced by Rogers in the 60s in this paper on diffusion of innovation. And Rogers suggested that the distribution of these types follows a bell curve. So you've got a small numbers of innovators and early adopters, and a larger number of early and late majority, and a small number of laggards. So under strategy 2, the program works with these innovators and early adopters, and then the innovation then spreads throughout the market as these other actors in turn adopt the innovation. And these first movers have particular characteristics the program needs to look for. So they've got high capacity, willing to take risks, able to absorb failures, and so on. So under strategy 2, the program directly supports a small number of first movers, and then this creates a ripple effect through the rest of the system. So it's quite interesting to unpack this a little bit and look at the assumptions that have to hold if the demonstration effect is to lead to spontaneous crowding in. So first of all, the success for the first movers has to be visible to the second movers, and the second movers have to attribute this success to the adoption of the innovation by the first movers, and those second movers have to have the incentives, capacities and resources to copy the innovation, and second movers are able to access the know-how or the transition mechanism. So note that all these assumptions have to hold for the demonstration effect to work. So there are some light touch things that the program can do to help this process along. So for example, to improve the visibility of the demonstration effect, the program can develop a business case study and disseminate this to the rest of the industry. So this could be directly or through an association, for example. And if the assumptions do not hold, then the program may need to move to strategy 3, which involves direct support to second movers to help them to also adopt the innovation. So this requires programs to address the capacity and incentive constraints of the second movers, which may differ, of course, from the constraints faced by the first movers. So important to note that strategy 3, doesn't entail just doing exactly the same thing with the second movers as the first movers. Also, there's no a priori reason why support to the second movers should be less intensive than support to the first movers, and we'll come back to that later. So the last 2 strategies involve recognizing that the pathway to scale may involve working in the wider market system. So for example, rather than working directly with agro dealers, the program might instead work with consultancies or trainers to develop a commercial service offering to agro dealers. Or the program might work with regulators or associations to remove regulatory constraints to scale or create pressure for change. So this is something that FSDK did around M-Pesa and mobile money when that came in. So just to illustrate, rather than working directly with agro dealers to create a demonstration effect, the program might instead work with a small number of agro dealers and consultancies who in turn can provide services to a large number of agro dealers. So I'll now just present some lessons in getting to scale from the paper. So the paper presents 10 lessons. In the interest of time, I'll just present a few of the most interesting. So the first lesson is that getting to scale takes time. So if we take an example, which Julian's going to come back to later. So Propcom started talking to Notori about fertilizer mini packets in April 2008. So just in the chat box, how long do you think it took Notori to reach over 1 million in sales? So just write your best guesses in the chat box and we'll see what people think. Okay, 4 years, 5 years, 28 months, 3 years, a year maybe, okay. Okay, so we've got quite a range of guesses from 6 months to 10 years. So when we did a review of this, in successful cases of getting to scale in agricultural sectors, it typically took at least 4 to 5 years to reach scale and often longer. So just to reveal the answer here, if we take the Propcom fertilizer mini packs example, it took 2 years from starting talks with Notori to launch the first pilot, another 2 years for Notori to roll out the pilot, and then it really took another 2 to 3 years for a competitive response to emerge from the second movers, which happened under the successor program, Propcom McCarthy. So it does take a while. I mean, in finance, we did find examples of new products reaching over 1 million customers in a shorter cycle, maybe 2 to 3 years. And in part, that's because obviously there's a much shorter business cycle compared to agriculture, where you might have to wait, year on year for the next planting season or harvest season to be able to modify the innovation. So donors really need to take this into account when setting milestones and determining program length. And getting to scale also takes considerable time, but also effort. So we could find no examples really where a program had achieved scale with an innovation by simply doing a few pilots and then sitting back and watching it take off. So programs really need to work quite intensively with firms, not only just to pilot the innovation, but also to roll out the innovation. For example, by providing technical support on distribution channels and helping to troubleshoot problems. So the second lesson is that within a program, only a few interventions will typically get to scale. So another question for you, so write the answers in the chat box. So for successful programs like Propcom, FSDK and CAVAC, what proportion of interventions do you think reached scale? So was it all of them, half of them, maybe 10%? Okay. So we've got a little bit of a range. I think 5% was the lowest, 40% was the highest. Oh, we've got a new low bid of 1%. But interestingly, a lot of people are saying around 20%. So that's interesting. Yeah, so when we looked at it, I don't know if people have heard of this 80-20 rule, but it actually seemed to be a fairly useful rule of thumb. So this says that 80% of your results come from about 20% of your activities. So for example, for the first phase of Propcom, over 1 million of the 1.2 million beneficiaries came from that Notori mini fertilizer packets intervention. With FSDK, the majority of the phase 2 outreach results came from the partnership with CBA and Mshwari. And CAVAC so Peter's going to spend some time talking about this, but only 3 of the 12 sectors delivered sizable outreach numbers. So this really points to the importance of programs testing lots of different innovations early on, and then dropping those not showing scale potential and doubling down on those that are. So moving on, so I think perhaps the biggest lesson from the paper is not to take the demonstration effect for granted. So we found lots of programs and lots of our programs, cite the demonstration effect as their pathway to scale. But when we looked at it, we could actually find relatively few examples of a strong demonstration effect working in practice. So programs cannot kind of lazily assume that the demonstration effect is going to hold. So to illustrate, I'm going to contrast two examples from the world of finance. So these two examples come from a recent FSDK, FSDA Springfield paper, which has just been published, and it's a very good read if people haven't seen that. So I'm going to take a success and a failure. So starting with a success, so from 2002 to 8, FSDK worked with Equity Bank to help it shift focus and strategy to the underserved mass market. And it was really the first bank in Kenya to really recognize the potential at the bottom of the pyramid and to shift its approach from product push to customer led. So this shift was very successful, with Equity recording very strong growth in market share and profits. And this led to clear demonstration effects in the Kenyan banking industry. For example, KCB was one of the early second movers, and there have been several others as well. And it's really changed the kind of landscape within Kenyan banking. And how did this crowding in happen? So there's two main ways. One is just investment in technical assistance by the second movers, but also there was a lot of poaching going on of Equity staff. So less successful was FSDK's work with savings and credits cooperatives, or Saccos. So in 2005, Saccos was seen by FSDK to be an important financial service provider for the poor. So for those of you not familiar with Saccos, they're membership-based, not-for-profit organisations, quite kind of deeply embedded in Kenyan society. And at the time, there are an estimated 3,200 Saccos with about 1.6 million members. And they were recognised to have a very mixed level of capacity, and there's some serious constraints in relation to financial management, internal systems and governance. So in phase one, FSDK provided direct capacity building for 8 of the best run Saccos. So the hope was that this would create a strong demonstration effect and lay the foundations for a Sacco service market. So a review found that this strategy had not worked. So there was really no spread. So it says that working with individual Saccos at best produced isolated pockets of excellence, but there was no spread beyond these. So they switched strategies, recognizing that they didn't really want to go around working directly with 3,000 Saccos. So in phase two, there was less emphasis on direct individual Sacco capacity building and more focus on creating a Sacco training market. So I worked with the Cooperatives College of Kenya and various Sacco consulting services. And they also worked with the Sacco regulator to strengthen regulations and therefore create pressure for change. So looking back at those 5 strategies I presented earlier, FSDK essentially switched from strategy 2, a kind of demonstration effect, to strategy 4 and 5, working in the wider support functions and rules around Saccos. And the results were equally disappointing, unfortunately. So a 2015 review found that Saccos that had gained from the direct capacity building were just as likely to be non-compliant with regulations as others. So the innovations that they wanted to see within Saccos weren't really taking root. The demand for training and capacity building from Saccos was weak. There was a very high subsidy of 75% and really no signs of a sustainable market for Sacco services emerging. So what explains the difference? So in both cases, FSDK had succeeded in identifying and strengthening the innovators and the early adopters. So in the case of banks, this created a strong demonstration effect, but in the case of Saccos, there was no ripple effect at all, just this isolated pockets of excellence that the review talked about. So if we look at each kind of sector in turn, if you think about banks. I mean, one thing to note about their industry structure is they've got a small number of large, well-resourced banks, all headquartered in Nairobi, and there's quite a tightly knit network. So I think in Kenya there's about 40 banks operating. So there was very high visibility of the equity demonstration effect. So it was clear to everyone in the industry that equity was doing something different and that this was driving significant improvements in profitability and market share within equity. There's also strong competition between banks, driven by the profit motive and a desire to maintain and win market share. And this created a strong incentive for other banks to copy. You had the early adopters and majority had the capability and resources to copy. And you also had this transition mechanism that allowed them to do so. So as I said, poaching equity staff was one strong transition mechanism, or they themselves were investing in TA and consultants. If you contrast that with Saccos, I mean, the industry structure is very different. So there you've got a large number of small Saccos scattered throughout Kenya. So with over 3,000 Saccos, the demonstration effect from the 8 lead Saccos was much less visible than in the case of equity. There's also limited competition between Saccos, so improvements in the 8s did not trigger a competitive response. It's also an incentive problem, so Saccos really didn't want or see the need to change or invest in capacity building, so partly because of traditions and norms around Saccos. So they're very much kind of community-owned institutions, seen as part of a movement, and many Sacco members kind of felt entitled to loans and resented external pressures to change. Also, the Sacco regulatory regime, so in practice, it was kind of seen as a dog that never bites. So working with the regulator really didn't create those incentives for change that the FSDK hoped for. So, you know, Rogers presents the distribution of the types as a bell curve, but, you know, that needn't be so in practice. So in the case of Saccos, the distribution actually seems to be more like the red dotted line, so kind of heavily negatively skewed towards the late majority and the laggards. So really a kind of key lesson, you know, probably the main lesson from the paper is just not to take the demonstration effect for granted. It's going to these assumptions hold in some sectors, but not in others. So it seemed to hold for banks in Kenya, but really not for the Saccos sector. So programs should not therefore kind of just lazily assume that the demonstration effect is going to hold in all cases. So programs need to think carefully for each innovation and each sector whether the assumptions presented on the previous slide are likely to hold, and think not just about whether, you know, there's one or two first movers that the program can work with, but also look beyond that and think, you know, who are the second movers going to be and what are their incentives and capacities. And really programs need to think this through right at the start of the intervention, rather than spending lots of time and money piloting innovations for which there's no pathway to scale. So the next lesson is that if the demonstration effect fails, and to get to scale, programs may need to work directly with second movers. And also second movers often require the same or even higher levels of support as the first movers. So some M4P programs are quite reluctant to work with second movers, and certainly as intensively as the first movers. You know, there's this kind of belief that that's somehow not strategic or facilitative to do so. But, you know, as we've seen, the demonstration effect does not automatically hold. And there's also no a priori reason why second movers should require less support than the first movers. So on incentives, you know, through the first movers, the business case for adopting the innovation should have been made. But second movers may be naturally more risk adverse than first movers, you know, which is after all why they are second movers and not first movers. Also, they may have lower levels of capacity, and in the absence of strong transition mechanisms, they may require more intensive capacity building than the first movers. Okay, so just moving on. The final lesson from the paper is that industry structure and country context has a significant bearing on the ability of innovations to reach scale. So in terms of country level factors that support scale, we identified four that seem to be important. So one is thicker markets with a range of large, well-resourced players. So this increases the choice of first movers, makes crowding in by second movers more likely, and reduces the kind of internal barriers to scale. We've got high population and population density. So this seems to reduce the cost of reaching large numbers of bottom of the pyramid consumers, improves the commercial viability of BOP innovations and the associated distribution models. Got a more developed financial sector. So improved access to finance obviously makes it easier for the first movers to finance investments in developing and rolling out innovations. And it also makes organic replication more likely by the second movers who perhaps cannot rely on soft financing or cost sharing from donors. And then obviously a supportive business environment. So looking at the first two factors in particular, it's perhaps not surprising that many of the examples of getting to scale actually come from Bangladesh and Nigeria. In terms of sector level factors that support getting to scale, so we identified three that seem particularly important. So one is high markets concentration. So it seems easier to reach scale in sectors that have a small number of large players. This means programs can get to scale through working with a handful of large players directly, and the demonstration effect is more likely to hold. Intensity of competition. So in highly competitive markets, competitive pressures are more likely to compel firms to innovate and copy successful innovations. So note that what matters here is less the number of firms, but the degree of overlap in customer segments and kind of geographic scope. So, for example, competition between, say, just 3 national mobile operators may be more intense than between hundreds of agro-dealers if those agro-dealers effectively enjoy local monopolies. Then finally, we've got density of networks. So where actors and individuals are tightly networked, ideas and innovations flow more readily. So geographic concentration helps. So, for example, the tendency of banks to all locate their headquarters in the same district of the commercial capital. Effective associations and business models also play a role. So similarly, although it can be very painful for programs when a key champion leaves a partner organization, staff churn also seems to support the spread of innovations. So as we saw in the equity example. So just looking at this list, it's maybe not surprising that many of the examples of getting to scale come from the financial sector, where you've got, high market concentration, pretty strong competition, and a high density of networks. So although programs can do little about the country context, they typically do have a choice of which sectors to intervene in. So when selecting sectors, programs should think about whether the nature of the sector is likely to support or hinder getting to scale. And for donors, it's important to recognize the importance of context. And in thin markets, it's just going to be much harder for programs to reach scale within, say, a 5-year time horizon. And actors, both the first movers and the second movers, are likely to require much more intensive support. Okay, so that's all from me. So I'm now going to hand over to Julian. So he's going to dive into some of these issues in a bit more detail and look at some lessons in getting to scale from PropCom.
Thank you. Sidi, pictured here, who lives in Benue State in the middle of Nigeria, asked his mother if they could buy some fertilizer. And she told him that they were not the sort of people that were meant to have fertilizer. It was only for big farmers or people with contacts in the local council who could get it. But then in 2009, Sidi was invited to a demonstration by a person in his village. The demonstration was on how to use fertilizer and where to buy it. So he bought some small packs that he could afford and showed it to his mother. And a few months later, Sidi showed us the difference in the quality of his maize. My name is Julian Peach, and that was an introduction to the work that ambitious people at Propcom and its successor, Propcom Mekarfi, did between 2009 until today, still working, to change the way the fertilizer market in Nigeria works. To make it work better for all people, especially poor women and men.
Just to jump in, you're kind of cutting in and out.
The details of the work are well presented.
I don't know whether there's
anything
you can do about that or not. It might be worth just starting from the beginning, but
Sidi was able to solve this problem because of a large
amount of
change in his village that was happening around.
Let
me now tell you.
Okay, sorry everyone. Let me see if we can get Julian a better connection. Otherwise, we might have to skip on to Peter and come back to Julian in a second. If you just bear with us for 1 minute. Left and he's trying to rejoin, so we're hoping that will fix the problem. So just bear with us for another minute and hopefully we'll have Julian for you in a second. Just while we're waiting for Julian, so we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat room, and we'll start compiling those. And I think what we're going to do is skip on to Peter, and hopefully we'll get Julian back. Peter, are you okay to do your session?
Can people hear me? Hello?
Peter,
can people hear me? So I wouldn't move on then a bit to my slides, huh? Oh, where are we? Yeah, there we were. Oh, back. What's happening? Yeah. So good morning, afternoon, evening for people. This is Peter. When Gareth asked me to present, I must confess I didn't read his paper yet. So I thought, I've seen so many projects that start with small technical pilots and then are disappointed in the end that it never gets to scale. So I thought, yes, I can help actually smashing that idea that you can do small technical pilots and you get it to large scale. But I assume you all read the paper that ASI wrote and you know why it doesn't work, is small pilots. Do you? Oh, maybe I remind some of you. I think these days we were enlightened by this whole complex reality, complex market thinking. And one of the big lessons there is you shouldn't engineer solutions. They normally don't work. And part of that is also in that complex socio-economic reality, companies know how to survive there, but you need to involve them from the beginning in the design of your intervention. So designing an intervention and later looking for a partner is normally not that successful. And of course, the problems you face when you do small pilots are normally technical problems, whereas the real problems we face is normally at the market level with incentives, business case, and stuff like that. But then I did read the paper that Gareth wrote later, and I actually thought it is a pretty good paper, and I agree with almost everything of it. So I somehow had to rewrite my presentation. So we forget about these small technical pilots, and we go now to the presentation, my real presentation, where I only try to add a bit of meat to what Gareth already explained. The next slide. Yeah, so what is scale? First of all, I think if programs don't manage to get to scale, you shouldn't even start your program. Scale is essential to justify being a program. But what is scale? For me, scale is partly related to outreach. That means the number of farmers and small enterprises that improve their productivity and increase their income. But it is, of course, directly linked also to impact. And these days, when we talk about impact, Gareth already told that a bit, it is, of course, based on a systemic change. I think thinking about scale is something you have to do early on in the beginning of your program, and not something that you think about in the end. So if we don't talk about scale with these small technical pilots, but we talk about scale, what Gareth just spoke about, what were some of the lessons I had, how you get to that scale? Now, the lessons actually come from 3 projects. Catalyst, Kavak, and my present project, Investing in Infrastructure. They all had or will have scale. Now, in Catalyst, the scale was in sectors like media, IT, vegetables, maize, etc. But at that time, I don't think we were able to credibly measure the impact. The Kavak, the agricultural program in Cambodia, also reached quite good scale, and I talk about it a bit later. And we were actually able to capture some of that impact in a credible way, but I think that's a different presentation. And finally, investing in infrastructure that just started, we also expect at least to influence 1 million people or so. Now, when we started in Catalyst in 2001, 2002, we used what is often the value chain analysis. So what the things that people like Frank Lusby and so taught us. So we started with value chain mapping, constraint analysis, intervention design, etc. But already then I think we realized that it doesn't really work. The thing that we were very happy at that time when we read William Easterly's book, The White Man's Burden, because that worded very well what we felt in the project. I think his core message is that projects should be searchers and shouldn't be planners. I think later when Owen Barter and others started to talk about complexity and development, they really gave that much more meat. Now, what does that really mean in a project like Catalyst? Well, we keep on talking about the Syngenta case, and even in your paper you mentioned it. Now let me explain you what really happened there. Prashant Rana and I went to Syngenta in Bangladesh, and we met the director, and we wanted to talk actually about maize seeds. And the director said, "No, I'm not interested." But he's a nice man, and politely he offered us some tea. So we sit there staring at each other over tea, and then he said, "You know, what I really would like to do is start investing in my retailer network, but my headquarters won't allow me to spend money on it." So within an hour or so, from not even considering this, we agreed with him on that intervention. the message in that is that you can plan and have all the graphs and all the documents, but it is really this eye for opportunities that you need to spot to get to scale. So you really need to be like the cat. And the other thing that is essential is don't spend too much time continuously thinking about brilliant ideas when you don't have a partner to dance with. These two things I think are essential to get to scale. So when Catalyst was really about trying things, learning lessons, we had a bit of a luxury in Kavak that we could apply these lessons. And I think the big lesson there was we applied adaptive management techniques and especially portfolio management. And that's one of the things I would like to talk about a bit more. But maybe quickly on investing in infrastructure, scale became even more important there. So instead of having a midterm review, it was decided to have a scalability review. So even the project size will be determined by the opportunity we find in the first years. So back to Kavak and the portfolio management. On the right, you see a bit of a schematic way of explaining how we allocated our resources over the initial markets in which we were active. So I think there were 19 or so, and the blue boxes is the amount of resources we allocated over time. So you see that just changed a lot. And the lessons we had in this portfolio management was, even in the first year, start with as many markets and as many interventions as you can, and don't do endless planning, but just get in there, find opportunities, start getting in the market, because only there you learn. And then over time, when you see where the opportunities really emerge with the partners and so, then you can reallocate your resources, what is often your people, to the markets that have most potential for scale. Maybe to be a bit more specific, in Kavak, we started in two of our markets with, both markets with one company to get into the market, to get knowledge. And then later we actually worked with, well, 10, 15, 20 similar companies to really get the scale we achieved. So scaling up is actually done at the same order of magnitude, the same kind of companies that you do more, rather than what I said in the beginning, a very small technical scale. That was a bit a lesson from Kavak. Now that sounds also nice afterwards at the end of the first phase of a project, but we actually did this really from the beginning. So early on, I think 1.5 years after the project really started, we already wrote a big document, a midterm review document that was more than 240 pages, where we analyzed each of the markets, we analyzed each of the partners, each of the potential for impact, and the key table in that was actually this table. This is really from the document we submitted in 2012, I think. So we, for each market, looked what is the potential outreach, what is the potential partners, what is the likelihood we can make a change, and we put that all in a table that with likelihood, or we call it expectations, that we might actually pull that off. So what we reported to our donor is not specific intervention impact, potential impact, but we presented a whole portfolio of likely impact, and we reported in a way on an aggregated potential impact, and that really helped the project a lot. So what were some of the things that worked in Cambodia? In Cambodia, you have around 2 million farmers, and at the end of phase 1, that is last year, we think we have reached around, let's say, with reached, I actually mean the clients of the companies we worked with were for fertilizer 1/3 of all farmers, and for pesticides 1/4. And now something went wrong with the slides. And if we applied the DCD standard way of calculating outreach, and for these two markets alone, 2 years after the intervention, we think we will have changed practices of around 300,000 farming households. Irrigation was a different story, where we only reached 20,000 farmers, but the impact on each farm was pretty big. Oh. This also went wrong. And another sector where we had a good outreach was media, where a survey revealed that at least 200,000 farmers claimed that they had changed or will change practices, farming practices, but we have no idea how big that impact is. Now, there was also a lot of other sectors where we started in that, but where we stopped, like agri-tools or seeds. And we stopped them partly because they just didn't work. We didn't find the partners. And in others, like in seeds, we actually were successful, but we thought we would never reach the scale that would justify staying in. So we moved our staff to sectors like pesticides, where there was much more potential. Like I said, I liked the paper that ASI and Gary wrote, and I took out some of the recommendations he made just to add a little bit of flavor to it. The first one, getting to scale requires flexibility and adaptability. Well, that is smack on. I love that. That is really where it's all about, I suppose. Then another recommendation was only a few interventions are likely to get to scale. Yes, but what do you do with that? Well, you need to accept and embrace that one. And the answer is what I just explained. You have to have a large portfolio from the beginning, look where you may get this traction, where you may get these partners for scale, and move your resources to that and drop the others. The story that getting to scale takes time. Well, I think it is even worse than the 5 years that you just talked about, Gareth, because I think in most projects I've seen it's actually longer, that you really get the full scale that you should have. So I think it's often after the end of the project. But I think, like I showed with our midterm review report, you can already earlier on make it credible what kind of scale you might achieve. There were two recommendations that I like to take together, the ones where you talk about demonstration effect and the ones about second movers. I have a slightly different view on that, and we also did it slightly different in Kavak. Like I said before, you need a company to work with, or let's say a partner to dance with, but you need to go a step further to be successful. I think the company needs to lead the dance. That means every company, you really need to listen very carefully what they want and how they want to do the intervention. And what we did in Kavak, for example, let's say the 10, 15, 20 companies we supported in fertilizer and pesticides, they all had a completely different intervention. Although it was all about communicating better with farmers, they all did it in a different way. So I think you have to be much more company centered and much better listen. So we don't lead the dance. The company should lead the dance. There are a few other of the comments or recommendations that are in the paper that when I read it, I thought, well, that's a bit of an open door. But maybe I can still say a few things about that. When I left Bangladesh, people said, oh, you go to Cambodia, that will be very difficult. Because Bangladesh is easy. You have, what is it, 180 million people or so. So getting to scale is not so difficult there. But when I went to Cambodia, people said, oh, these farmers are very poor, there are no companies, it's very small, there is no one to work with, it's not a good government, you won't find good staff. So that is what many people would call thin markets. I think the key there is to success is not to pre-cook already what you're going to do, but to have this flexibility. And then you often can find things, I'm very convinced. In Kavak, we were really allowed to look for the places where we could have the impact and work on that, and that worked. And actually, that's also the case for big projects, because the first sectors we selected in Catalyst, they were agri-tools and knitwear, and they both failed. So yeah, you need that flexibility to find these markets where you can find your scale. Now I hope my last slide still works. Yeah. So I Googled scale in private sector development and found something on Wikipedia, and let me read that as a final thing. Present best practices to get interventions to scale reveal that the secret lies in solid portfolio management, where practitioners start programs with a wide portfolio of markets and an active reallocation of resources to achieve optimal scale and impact at the end of the program. Okay, that was my presentation. Thank you. Back to Gareth, I suppose.
That was really interesting. So I'm sure I've already seen lots of questions coming through. So we'll hopefully have some time for some questions for Peter at the end. Let's see. Hopefully we have Julian back with us. So I'll hand over to Julian now, and hopefully we'll be able to hear him. Over to you, Julian.
Thanks, Gareth. I'm going to move closer to the end of my presentation. Just there. So I'll concentrate on the lessons from PropCom experience and some advice in more general terms. That's a picture of a cow with a bell on it, and it's used by farmers to indicate where on the mountain the herd is currently situated. And I used that example some time ago to explain our strategy that we saw Notori as a leader of the market system change. But the reality in the photo is more complicated than it seems, because the context is in the background and the grass is underneath the cow's feet, and we don't tend to look there. As you just heard, or you wouldn't have heard, but if you read the case study about PropCom, the context in Nigeria changed a lot during the process of the intervention, and that caused us some opportunities but also a lot of problems. So when you see this picture, I encourage you to remember the grass, the air, the stomach parasites, and the weather. Lesson 5 from Gareth's paper is do not take the demonstration effect for granted. This is true. We didn't take it for granted, and we worked considerably with some success on policy, and that was an attempt to change commercial incentives for companies. However, I will say on a lighter note, I've come to more appreciate the TED talk by Derek Sivers in February 2010, when he showed us that the first follower in a movement is more important than the leader. Secondly, I'd emphasize lesson 3 from Gareth's paper. Early on, check the business case. The future gain of change has to be far greater than the immediate pain of change, or it won't be supported. Even in countries where there is economic stagnation, life can change, economies can grow. The whole point about development is that it's about change. So don't give up hope yet. We're more likely to get change if the gain is significant. So do your sums and check. And try not to boost the gain of the change with too much temporary sugar, otherwise it won't last and you won't reach scale. A third lesson is always support competitiveness, because that's what leads to growth. There were opportunities for the program to overinvest in Notori or to closely support the e-voucher program. We always tried not to undermine competitiveness. And the final slide. As Peter said, portfolio. Not all markets are ready to change in a large way, and the risks and time needed to facilitate large-scale change needs to be balanced in a portfolio with other investments. Usually, market systems programs are part of an economic or inclusive growth agenda. So it's prudent to achieve that agenda through a mix of investments held in one program portfolio as part of a larger donor portfolio. Managers, you should all review your strategies every quarter to be sure that they are still appropriate. Markets change, and so must we. Learn from mistakes and failures. Don't just press play and hope it works. If your program's in a hurry, then you may be tempted to skip the market system research and go straight to partner selection and offer. Shoot first and aim second. There can be times when that strategy is correct, but be careful as it can lead to expensive mistakes and not reaching scale. If you need to take quick action, then leave space for the partner to react, during which time you can get a greater understanding of the market, interpret the partner's moves, and aim the intervention strategy. In contrast, if your program has lots of time, try not to succumb to the well-known disease of paralysis by analysis, sometimes known as workshopitis. One could conclude from reading the M4P books that this is a rigorous science stemming from detailed, rational understanding of a market system. This is largely true, but I'd encourage you to adopt an attitude of creativity and curiosity, continuing to observe and notice what's going on in a market, reappraising known facts and discovering unknown facts. Markets are complex, and a system of interconnected markets is even more complicated. It requires a lot of work to understand and determination to remain knowledgeable. An effective strategy requires a courageous flourish and some luck. We needed a lot of courage to work with Notori at the beginning, as it was closely associated with a wanted criminal and was headquartered in a violent part of Nigeria. And everyone said it was impossible to get a free market for fertilizer in Nigeria because of the endemic corruption. We also had some luck. Our initial introduction to the company was through a staff member of the program. If you want to get to scale, measure engagement. We can discuss that later, but for some more advice, I really encourage you to read Chapter 5 of the M4P Operational Guide. And finally, a great strategy without some measure of desire is not going to win the race. Nelson Mandela did not have a results chain when he walked out of the Victor Verster prison in 1990, but he was on a mission. So I encourage managers to put as much effort into building the desire for success as you do in designing and documenting an appropriate strategy. An effective program has clear areas of responsibility and accountability. This is done so that people can manage themselves, which is far more satisfying, think for themselves, and act as intended. Sorry for the audio problems earlier. That's all from me, and I hope you found it as enjoyable as the women shown in the next slide.
Okay, let me skip forward. So we're going to take some questions now. So let me just catch up with the slides. Okay, so thank you very much to Peter and Julian for the presentations. So I think we've got about 20 minutes probably for some questions. So some people have already posted some questions when you registered for the webinar. Feel free to also send some any new questions you have in the chat box. Also, I think you can post on the Beam LinkedIn group if we don't get to answer any of your questions, or if you have new questions come up, and we'll be monitoring that as well and try to get back to you after the webinar. So just to start, I had a question through from Ovo from Propcon McCarthy. So he asks, in cases where some policies or infrastructure are the major barriers to scale, to what extent does the market systems development approach allow you to address these? So maybe I'll turn that over to Julian and Peter, because I know, Peter, you're currently working on a program that focuses on infrastructure. And Julian, you in your presentation hinted at the kind of policy work that you got involved with around fertilizer in Nigeria.
Want to go first, Julian?
Okay, thanks, Peter. I'd just say that half of a market system diagram, which people tend to forget, is the bottom half. We tend to focus on sport markets on the top. So the answer is yes, of course, we can work on the public sector. and society and culture and norms and laws and regulations. It's half of where we work.
Yeah, but with all the lessons we had, market system development, etc., we sometimes forget that these are just ways to implement good development practices. And when you move to other sectors like infrastructure, what I do now, I apply the same basic good development practices of systemic change and so, but in a sector that has much more a public sector notice as well. Yeah, you can have whole programs around that. But don't be focused just on that donut too narrowly. I mean, apply your underlying good development practices. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks, Peter and Julian. That's helpful. Yeah, just to add, I think the great thing about market systems development programs is they have, complete flexibility to work wherever the constraints are in a sector. So as Julian said, if there are problems down in the bottom half of your donut, then there's no reason at all why you shouldn't work there. And a lot of the cases of getting to scale did involve some policy work. So if you think of M-Pesa, for example, that's often held up as an example of, as the initial challenge fund with Safaricom and Vodafone, and then everyone knows the subsequent scale that achieved. But behind that, there was FSD Kenya was actually doing a lot of work on the regulations, because when mobile money came out, it completely kind of bamboozled the regulators, because they didn't know, is it, who should regulate it? Is it the bank regulator? Is it the mobile operator regulator? Just how do we deal with that? And until that regulatory certainty was put in place, Safaricom wasn't ever going to really scale up the innovation, and you weren't going to get the second movers. They wouldn't have had the confidence either to invest. So, behind that initial challenge fund work with Safaricom, there was a lot of regulatory work that went on almost behind the scenes. So I hope that answered your question, Ovo. So moving on, there's some linked questions here. So one from Alan RDC. So the question is, how do you get to scale in tiny markets full of humanitarian responses? And then also from Martin from Helvetas, slightly linked question, how to reach scale in the context of thin markets. Peter, do you want to kick this off? I know you touched on this a little bit in your presentation.
I think there are actually two answers. The first answer is, don't get locked in your design documents or whatever in we have to work in these sectors, whereas the opportunity may be somewhere else. So really be the cat looking for the fish, and look for these opportunities, and they might be in different markets and in different sectors. My second answer is, market development doesn't always give solutions. There are markets where it just doesn't work. So the other answer is stay out. If it doesn't work, and do something else, get another job in a way. But it's not a panacea for everything in every country. There are countries where you really can get value for money, where your investments are justified by the potential impact, and there are just places where it didn't work. I think if you go back many years, what Rob Hitchens wrote in one of these papers 15 years ago already was, there is this viability void. There are places where you just can't do things, so do something else. So it's not always an answer.
Julian, did you want to come in? I suppose, I don't know to what extent when you were working with fertilizer in Nigeria, you could say Nigeria is not necessarily a thin market, but in terms of all the distortions that were in the fertilizer market from both the government and I guess I presume there were NGOs and so forth still distributing free fertilizer and agro inputs. Did you have any thoughts on how we can operate in such environments?
I think that the notion of thin markets is a bit misleading. A thin market is a market where there are not many buyers or sellers, and most developing countries, poor countries, have lots and lots of people, and they are active economically. They're doing something. So as Peter said, find out what they're doing and capitalize on that. Generally, I find that where people talk about difficulties, it's because they don't properly understand the market or the market opportunity well enough. They haven't looked at it. They've tended to look at the screen on their computer rather than talk to people and get out and talk with businesses. In Sub-Saharan Africa is a tiny market in proportion to the global fertilizer market, and Sub-Saharan Africa is minuscule. Nigeria, only 20%, only about 20% of poor smallholders receive fertilizer. So you could say it's a really small market and we're not going to work in it. But that was a problem, but also an opportunity. So I'll go back to what I said earlier. If you're in a place where there's economic stagnation, conflict, where things appear to be slow, where private sector is hesitating, then see what can be changed and facilitate that change. That's our job.
We add one more thing. Actually, if you're in a market that works perfect, then you don't need us. I mean, the reason we are partly there because the markets are imperfect. So if there is wrong regulation, it is too risky for enterprises to invest, that is actually one of the reasons we're in there. So you should almost be happy, otherwise you didn't have a job.
Yeah, good point, Peter. Okay, thank you both. There's a good question here from Lindy from Diffid, and I think all three of us talked about kind of the importance of a portfolio approach and kind of dropping those innovations and interventions that aren't going to scale and kind of doubling down on the ones that are. So Lindy just asked a practical question. She says, it is particularly challenging knowing if and when to adapt and ultimately terminate interventions. How can we better assess scale potential in these decisions? Peter, do you want to, because you showed that interesting graph from Kavak with the the different kind of intensities of resources that you were putting into the different sectors. It might be interesting just to talk a little bit about how you made those decisions. What kind of analysis were you doing? What were you looking out for? And maybe something around the wider culture that allowed you to do that. And similarly, Julian, if you had examples.
Yeah, thank you, Gareth. It's not only how, it's also who does it. And it's funny that this comes from a donor person, because often the structures around projects don't really allow for that flexibility. And I think you do need to lead the flexibility with a project to step in and out. The key thing is probably finding partners or not. So it is almost like you put out the bait in a lot of different ponds and you see where they bite. And then when you start getting in the market and start learning how many fish there is, you can decide how to put more in it and less. So in Kavak, I really thought we would be very successful in the seed market. And we never got companies really to work with us. And the ones that worked with us were not really enthusiastic. Whereas in the fertilizer market, we worked with one or two, and others were lining up. And in the pesticides market, even more. One of the big international ones actually said to us, yeah, we have to do this, because you leave us no choice. All our competitors do it. We have to step in there. So it is, I think, much about, are these partners biting? Is your do you have the right offer, and do the others come in? So that is what you need to monitor and step in. And you need to leave it to the project.
I'd add that it really helps if there's a culture in the program of intellectual honesty, where people face up to what's happening, what they've done, the analysis that they've done, and the new information they're collecting. It's really important also that we own and have a passion for our work, but that we're not obsessed with it and protective and guarding our work and hiding bad news from people. A simple measure of having a peer review every now and then within the program allows somebody to say, look, this is going better than I thought it was. I think it justifies putting more resources and time and energy into it, or the opposite. This isn't going as well as we thought. We've discovered some new information. We've tried 5 and 10 and 50 different things and it's still not working. Let's move on. The only comment I would make is don't totally kill any innovation. I always leave them on the back burner because you never know how the context can change and something might pop up and surprise you one day.
Thank you both. I'm just scanning through some of the questions now. So lots of people are asking about measurement, and I mean that could be a whole session on itself in terms of how do you actually measure scale and some of these indirect impacts. I also noticed we have Ali and Hans in the participants. It would be great if we could give them the mic too, because I know they have a lot of experience in this area. But let's just touch on the measurement issue briefly. So there's a question here from Paul from MDF. So he asks, are there good examples of successful results measurements of indirect impacts? So looking at crowding in, copying, etc., from such scale interventions. And what are good measurement tips or lessons to follow? Any thoughts on that, Peter or Julian, before I can add some things at the end?
Shall I give it a go?
Sure, Peter.
Well, first of all, doing result measurements we know now is not a simple thing. With a few tips you can do. I think we have a long history with DCD standard and so on. We know it's pretty hard, but I think programs like CAVAC has showed that it's possible. In CAVAC, actually, we decided to drop crowding in and copying for a few reasons. First of all, the impact already took a long time. And crowding in and copying will even take longer, so that would be way beyond the boundaries of the program. So for very practical reasons, we just ignored them. And also, when you really get into the details of finding ways to attribute your impact, that is already hard with your direct interventions if it is large scale. It is even way harder to attribute impact for indirect impact with crowding in, and so it's way harder to find proper attribution strategies. So actually I would worry, just capture your direct impact first. I mean, it doesn't mean you don't look at indirect. You should look if other companies get in the market. You should notice and report these things, but really bringing that to numbers of impact, I would just focus on direct impact first. That is difficult enough, it has proven.
Did you have any thoughts?
Yep. I'd say two things. Early on, collect evidence about indirect effects. For example, if you are visiting a range of companies and several of them say that they're not interested in the innovation that you foresee for that market, then note that down. Then later on, if you go back to see them and you find that they have been taking up that innovation and you ask them, why did you take up that innovation? And if there's any attribution to the work that you've done or the work that the company that started with has done, then write that down as well. One of the problems with assessing change that's indirect is that we only assess it at the last moment. The other thing I'd say is, I was going to reference earlier on, there's a lot that can be done to measure engagement. There's a very good study by Steve Montague called The Need to Build Reach into Results Logics and Performance Frameworks. I'll type that up on the chat, but if you put it into Google, you'll find the work. And measuring engagement and being aware of engagement in market systems change makes it slightly easier to get and measure indirect effects.
I would just second that. I mean, when it comes to crowding in, you know, these are companies that you might not necessarily be working with. So really, you've got to, you know, look beyond your partners and just scan the kind of industry and sector that you're working with. I mean, one thing is, you know, to attend industry events and so forth, and just, you know, make sure you're aware of what's going on. Other things we've tried is just asking our partners themselves what they see their competitors getting up to, because often they will have a good idea of if, you know, if they have a sense of, you know, someone else is, you know, a competitor is copying something that they've done. And then once you've identified those potential copycats, then yeah, the best thing is to go and speak to them and ask them why they've adopted that particular innovation. And sometimes they will tell you, yeah, it's because of this other company. We saw them doing it first, and it was successful. So as Julian said, you want to write those quotes down. For example, that quote from KCB in the equity example, you know, they very clearly said that it was, you know, really because of what equity was doing that they changed that sector. You know, so then that gives you some kind of confidence, you know, that you are having a wider kind of ripple effect beyond your partners. But then
Gareth,
trying to work out what the outreach from those copycats are can be hard, because yeah, you might not have actually worked with them, so you might not have the same level of access that you would with the partners. So then that can become tricky. We do actually have, so Ali and Hans have been dragged up into the presenters box, and I think they can now speak to us from wherever they may be. I don't know, Ali or Hans, if you had any reflections or tips on this. Ali and Hans, are you able to speak? I think you might have to connect. If you click at the top, you can click connect your microphone. Is that working? Okay, maybe we'll try and come back to Ali or Hans if we can get the technology working. Oh, I see Hans has popped up with a little microphone sign. Can you hear us now, Hans, and speak? I think you just have to unmute your mic.
Can you hear me?
Ali, yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. Just figuring out the technology there. I think that I agree with a lot of what has already been said by Julian and Gareth. It takes, and Peter, it takes an investigative reporter approach. It's not like your more typical results measurement where it's all, you know, you can sort of think, okay, this is my results chain and this is exactly how I'm going to measure this in advance. You can have some ideas about that, but it's much more about following your nose and looking at how the market system is changing and analyzing to what extent there might have been a contribution to that from what the program did and what the partners of the program have done. And that's your first step. And there are examples of that around the world. It's a much bigger and more challenging step to then figure out, well, what does that mean in terms of the outreach to at the beneficiary level? But again, you can get to estimates. And I would agree with Peter in saying it's much more challenging to get to an understanding of attribution in the case of indirect impacts. but I don't think we should be throwing in the towel. And the DCD actually has quite a nice paper which outlines some guidelines around, what is credible attribution for systemic change, which is a different, it's not going to be scientific proof. It's a different level of credibility than we would be looking for direct impacts, but it's much more around this kind of sleuthing approach of saying, well, what are the changes? What might have been the transition mechanisms that transferred information about one company to another or one beneficiary to another, and that kind of thing, as opposed to the more, classic methodologies we might be using with direct results.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And yeah, we'll try and post links to some of the guidance that Hans and Ali have mentioned, so people can look at that if they're interested. Just time for one last question, I think. So this question is from James Schmidt from Smithsonian. So he asks, how can engagement with state-level institutions like a Chamber of Commerce be leveraged for the project benefit? So just to give one way, so remember when I was talking about the kind of visibility of the demonstration effect, and one thing you can do is develop, say, business case studies of successful adoption by the first mover, and then use that to try and make the case to the rest of the industry. And you can do that directly, or potentially more powerfully if you work with an association to do that, because they already have the networks and the trust with the industry. Well, depending on how good the association is, that can be quite powerful. So we tried that in Nepal, for example, with the Pigs Association, to try and encourage crowding in there. Julian and Peter, I don't know if you had any last thoughts on that.
I'll start.
I can say.
There's a long record of using business membership organizations, some of which is successful because the BMO is effective, and a lot of which is disastrous because the BMO is not effective. So look at that literature. It all came into the stream that led to market systems development. There's loads of work on business development services, business membership organizations, but I would just say check whether or not that Chamber of Commerce is effective. Is it member driven? Does it have a lot of active networks? Does it provide services that members use? And if it does, then yes, it can leverage change dramatically.
Maybe I'll add a quick thing. I think in Catalyst we were very successful with a few sector organizations, or BMOs, like Julian called them, but they have the same incentive to let the market grow. Chambers, I think it's much more difficult because they're often way more political. But I think a golden rule is, if you consider it, is if you do a donut, who does, who pays, etc., you need to leave the BMO in their core role. And you can't add everything to BMO because you can't find a company to do it. So they need to stay in their core role of advocacy and that kind of things. But it can really work, and it worked well in Catalyst in Bangladesh, in furniture, in the ponds, and in a way also in plastics.
Thank you very much, Peter and Julian. Okay, so we're out of time, I'm afraid. So thank you very much to Peter and Julian for presenting today, and impromptu contribution from Ali as well at the end. Thank you to Sarah and Ashley at the Beam Exchange for hosting the webinar. Just if you are interested in reading more, so the paper that we wrote is available on the Beam website. So here's the link for it. And I think there's also a Beam LinkedIn group where you can continue to ask questions and discuss amongst yourselves, and hopefully some of us will be able to chip in on that as well. So thank you very much for your time. And yeah, that's it. Thanks.